love, and welcome to Beyond the Drip, a podcast about infusion therapy and all things infusion. It is now March, and when we think about March, we think about NHIA. Every year, National Home Infusion Association creeps up to us. It always seems like it comes really, really quick. And so we're super excited for March to be able to kick off with a special guest, Connie Sullivan, President and CEO of the National Home Infusion Association. Connie, thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be incredible. Obviously, co-hosts are here. Brandon Carpenter of MedEdge, Brian O'Sullivan of Sullivan Group, Pam McIntyre, Expert Infusion Nurses Association. Do want a quick housekeeping note that Paula Roth, the pro-chant, is unable to be here due to a family emergency. So certainly sending our thoughts and our prayers to Paula, and wish that Paula comes back to us really, really quick. Excited to see her in DC. But Connie, we are talking about NHI. Brandon and I talk about this. We both work at MedEdge, and we laugh when we say, "Oh, Super Bowl's coming," because if you do as much business in infusion as us, NHI is our Super Bowl. We talk about it. And I think almost everybody here has a booth, and we were talking about my first NHIA as 2013, Brandon's 2010, Pam's 2020. Brian's our new guy. It was last year, so he's recently invested. So, but we've all been going for a really long time. I wanted to start our conversation really around just what you kind of view NHIA at right now as a backstory. I mean, as you look at it and like where its place is, and then maybe you could talk about how your journey to president and CEO is.
Yeah, no, but I love that analogy. It is our Super Bowl. And, I've been in this industry, gosh, I kind of stopped. Once you have 25 years, you don't really need more than that. It just makes you sound old. So I kind of stopped there. But okay, so let's see, where did things start? So I'll tell you about my path to NHIA the very first time. I was a pharmacist at a franchise in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I decided I was ready for management. So I decided I'm going to go find a management job. And back then we didn't have the internet. They used to print this book out and send it out to pharmacies of all the jobs that were available. And there were 3 home infusion management jobs available. So I could choose between New Orleans. I grew up in Ohio, and there was one in Ohio. I was like, I'm not going back there. And then there was one in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I was like, Minneapolis is where it is. So I applied for the job, got it. I moved up there, and I was literally took over this little tiny pharmacy. It was a mess. I'll just tell you, it was kind of a disaster, but it was like, you just start by cleaning out the closets, right? Figuring out what do they even have in stock. And as I'm doing that, a B. Braun rep walks in, and she must have sized me up in 5 minutes. She goes, it's probably a good idea for you to go to this NHIA conference. You look like you could use some help. And that's how I ended up at NHIA for the first time. And I just, loved it. And I was like, I found my people, and it was, it really helped me develop the skills that I needed to become a manager, and then, move up from there. How I ended up at NHIA is, I kind of hired myself. I went to Nancy Kramer, who everybody knows and loves. Right. I was like, you guys could use a pharmacist. Would you ever consider hiring a pharmacist? And she was like, oh my gosh, we'd love to have a pharmacist. And so I kind of talked them into hiring me, and created a position around research and data, and took on a few projects. And then, a couple of years later, here I am. So that's kind of the story.
What was that the beginning? I think back to Brandon and I were on the executive team of a group called Rock Pond Solutions. You probably remember it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's where we got our start originally in the industry. And we had the NHIA data initiative. Was that around that time? Was that? Yeah. Okay. All right. That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. So obviously you got a lot of passion for the industry, I guess, thinking about folks who need to go to NHIA, make your pitch here, right? Like, we're a month away. We're 31 days. We're 31 days as we tape away from opening session. Why does someone who has a passion to impact the infusion pharmacy industry, why should this be something they don't miss every year?
Well, I think that's a great question. And one of the things I think I'm most proud of over the last, I'd say 3 to 4 years in particular, is that we have seen a whole new crop of clinicians and leaders attending NHIA that we didn't used to see. You guys have been around a long time, and it used to be a little more like you see the same people every year, and you love seeing those people. And, it's kind of a small community. But now when you go to NHIA, you might know maybe half the people, or recognize half the people there. And there's a lot of opportunity to network and just meet more people that are newer to the industry, share your knowledge if you're one of the veterans, or just kind of learn and see who's joining this industry. There are a lot of new players, new companies, a lot of investment coming in from people who are coming from a lot of different backgrounds. And so I think if you're newer to the industry, the answer is somewhat obvious. You're coming to learn and you're coming to network. But I think most importantly, from a company standpoint, this is how you build your bench, right? You need leaders who understand more than just what they are seeing on a day-to-day basis. There's a bigger picture out there of what trends are occurring, what opportunities might there be that you're not necessarily seeing in your own local market yet, but maybe could be there, and you just need to know to look for them. So we talk about a lot of different things, from advocacy to other, not necessarily home infusion related, but other industry trends that we're seeing that could have an impact on us. So what's happening in home health, for example, or regulations that are maybe impacting pharmacy more generally, but could have an impact on home infusion as well.
Yeah, it's a great tie-in to probably 3 or 4 years ago. I remember mentioning that it felt like maybe NHIA was, or maybe 5 years ago, it was kind of similar, similar. And then something seemed to happen. And I don't know who to credit. I'm sure it's your amazing staff. I started to say, you see these numbers? You see these boosts? Like PE, like it's a lot of fun. And I said, I'm 3-4, the last 3-4 in, and saying it feels like a rejuvenation of home infusion in the industry. What do you credit that to? Because the meeting feels like it's surging. It really does.
Yeah, the changes at the meeting, I mean, you're feeling it, and it's because of an intentional effort by the staff to say, what can we do differently? How do we keep the meeting feeling fresh? What should we try to kind of, you go to the meeting, and there's kind of a fine line there. There is some, value in the familiar, right? There are good things about our meetings that we've had for years. There's a sense of community. The round tables, for example, people just love those things, but how can we make them better? How do we introduce new things? People's attention span's a little shorter than it used to be sometimes. So how do we do more short sessions? How do we give people more of an opportunity to go into detail about their products in the exhibit hall, things like that. So we have a staff that are dedicated to just making the conference the best possible experience and breathing new life into it for people who have been coming for 25 years, but also, maintaining the things that we love about it, which is, the passion for the industry comes through. And some of it's that intangible thing you never want to lose, right?
For our listeners, if you're just joining us, Beyond the Drip is really about infusion, but it's about everything beyond the actual drip, right? And so every host has questions for our guests in different things. So it might be rev cycle or technology or payer strategy or actual clinical care. We're going to get to that in a second. I want to finish up real quick. And, you're the leader here. What's the future? Like, what are you thinking about the future? Where does the meeting go? Where do you want to press? What do you want to see 5, 10, 15 years from now?
As far as our meeting goes.
Yeah. Or just advocacy, or the entire association, just wherever you want to take it.
I think the way I see our job at NHIA is to create the environment where everyone has an opportunity to be successful. And our mission at NHIA is to make home infusion accessible to everyone and provide that high quality care. So we really do, follow our mission and our vision at NHIA and say, what do we need? What do our members need from us to be able to succeed? And some of that is connecting people, just making it possible for you to find a resource that you need to solve an issue or to take advantage of a new opportunity, exposing people to what the newest and latest trends are in products and services that are out there. So I think from a meeting standpoint, it's really all about that, and keeping patients at the center of everything, and reminding ourselves this is why we're here. And there's nothing more powerful than meeting patients and including them in the conversation and understanding literally where they are and what they need from us. So I think, I feel like as long as we continue to bring that at the conference through the speakers, through the programs that we're offering, people will show up and continue to support the conference. I think as an industry, our main priority at NHIA is a lot of advocacy, right? that used to mean we need a Medicare benefit. And that's kind of where, our sole focus was for many years. I kind of tend to like to broaden that lens out to commercial payer advocacy, just kind of looking at it as making sure that we're always here to kind of represent the industry. So here's an example. I went to a hearing yesterday here in Colorado. A physician got a bill introduced that would force Medicaid to address their PN reimbursement rate to make sure there's an adequate network of providers because they're down to one provider. And that worries this physician and her patients, that they feel very vulnerable because of that. And I feel like, I think that's fantastic and let's go support this legislation. But it's also important, not just from an advocacy perspective, but to show up and to sit at the table next to the families and next to the physicians and be a partner to them and explain why we're in the situation that we're in. It's not that we don't want to serve those patients. And it's not a matter of like, if we can't make X amount of dollars, we're not interested. It's we're facing a lot of real challenges. And so I feel like it's that also, making home infusion better understood and making it part of the whole fabric of post-acute care and making sure people understand that we're here as a partner. So just kind of being that voice and being there and present and including as many people in that process as we can.
Yeah. I think it feels like there's nothing that probably feels more alone than a patient that needs care who can't get it, or a doctor who wants to care for their patient and can't provide it, So, sitting at that table seems like a kind of a powerful moment. Getting into our round robin here, and Brian, I think I'm going to start with you. Brian O'Sullivan Group, you deal with payers all the time. So, maybe you can talk a little bit around, payers and what you're seeing and get some feedback from Connie here.
Sure, thanks. And Connie, as you were talking, I was thinking about the O'Sullivan Groups works in other verticals. We work with surgery centers, hospitals, and other things. And some of those associations have splintered because they're not voices for their entire membership. They're dominated by large national players. The independents don't feel they have a voice. Or very urban focused. The rural providers don't have a voice. There's something to be credited to NHIA of being a voice for everybody, because you don't have complete competing splinter groups. So being that an advocate for the entire industry is a credit to NHIA. But going back to something specific to what we focus on is that also the bringing payers to the table. So you have the Advocacy and Payer Relations Committee, and I know there's some anonymity to that group of it's not a public list of who comes to the table. So I think that's helpful for them. But really, how'd you bring them to the table? How do they continue showing up that they're not the enemy, right? Because a lot of times on this podcast, we do.
It's fair. Connie, we do. There's some punching bags here, unfortunately, but we will not put you in that room. I promise.
Yeah. So you obviously have some honey to offer them rather than just vinegar. So what's that like of bringing them to the table and the invite, and what do they get out of it?
I'll be very honest and say our efforts around commercial payer advocacy have been a lot of trial and error and trying to figure out. We feel like there's an appetite for discussion and that they have an interest in understanding our industry better and also have some concerns about having an adequate home infusion network. But they also, they have questions, but they also have agendas and they have things that they're trying to accomplish. We obviously have things we would love to see change or would love to share with them. And sometimes we've had good, productive conversations, and sometimes we're just talking right past each other and it's not working. And so we're still trying to figure out what the right formula is for having good, constructive conversations with payers where we can find some mutual goals to work on together that meet both of our needs. And so we're trying it. We've had 2 payer summits where we invited, kind of just cast a wide net. Anybody who wants to come can come. And here's an agenda. And we did some presentations and we very much tried to provide examples of where a policy is actually being counterproductive to the payer and their goals. And so we gave them examples like, okay, cath flow is like one of the best examples, right? Like their policy around cath flow was that the patient would have a much higher copay if the home health nurse would come out and resolve that clot versus if they would go to the ER, the patient pays nothing. So which do you think the patient's going to choose based on the reimbursement? And just pointing things out to them like that, like, well, you could be using us better and more effectively to lower your total cost of care. And what we've kind of learned is that it depends on who came to the meeting, right? If they're high enough and they're a medical director, maybe they get that and that message resonates. If they're the person who all their job is to manage the spreadsheet of rates, and like my job is to just get this number to zero at the bottom, they're not thinking about total cost of care. That's just not their job. And, that message, they're like, well, that's nice, but I don't have any control over that. So I think with payers, for me, it's about how do you get to the right people that can institute some different thinking at the payer and understand capabilities. I still take issue with the fact that they put us in ancillary services. I wish that term would go away. If you look up the definition of ancillary, it's literally less important, less primary. I'm like, if you're going to continue to look at it that way, you're never going to maximize the value of home infusion. But I think we're still trying. And so we are putting together a different approach this year. We're developing a payer advisory council where we can have multiple meetings with the same people about topics and ask them to bring topics to the table. We'll bring things to the table, offer them education, resources, information, views of what we're seeing. And it's just about to kick off. So, we're going to go that route versus trying to get people to fly to in-person meetings, which was just hard for them to be able to get the time and buy-in for travel expenses and things like that. So stay tuned. I'll keep you posted.
Connie, that was music to my ears. You hit some buzzwords for me of just sort of talking past each other. I'm almost thinking of we have wars in the world right now, and to negotiate a truce, right? You've got to hear and be heard, right? And if you're not hearing and being heard, you're not getting anywhere. So I really appreciate those things with advocacy and that sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't. So in our conversations with home infusion clients, we get a lot of that. They're not understanding, and couldn't agree more. And again, this is not beating up the payers, but the word vendor, right? You complimented nurses in your opening thing, that they're fun, but it's a combination really of pharmacists and nurses delivering a product, right? Not to knock on DME, but DME is a product, right? But home infusion is a service. It really has a service. So to talk about an ancillary or vendor, I think the professionals that are involved don't find that flattering. So getting that common understanding of what the service is, it's not a commodity, it's a service. So I really appreciate that. But going that, I think you have another challenge, right? As the industry, private equity, and other investors come in, you have some pretty big players in your association that are owned by payers now. So they're a member of NHIA, a dues fee they're contributing, but they're also funded, owned, operated by a payer or sometimes an integrated delivery system, right? They're a hospital and they have maybe different agendas than a freestanding pharmacy-based provider. It seems like that could easily be a us versus them dynamic, right? Which there's no solution, no common ground. How do you how does that dynamic play in? And really, even when you go to DC, right? A big part of NHA is advocacy, legislative, or you mentioned Colorado when you go to a state. I know that's getting a big question here. Well, how does that play out in your day to day? Is it helpful? Is it challenging? What does that look like for you?
It's a good question. I think at the end of the day, regardless of who owns you or what your structure is, I think one of the things that helps us from an advocacy perspective or just even from a management of member interest perspective at NHA is that operationally on the ground in the facility at the point of patient care, it doesn't look very different depending on who owns you, right? I mean, if you're a big site for option care, one of their sites, or you're hospital based, or you're private equity, or you're owned by a payer in a vertically integrated, system. Honestly, your challenges in the pharmacy, in the reimbursement realm, from a prior authorization standpoint, aren't very different. You're all facing kind of some of the same things. In some ways, I almost think it's harder to operate as within a big structure because And I had this situation when I worked as a pharmacist and I was a director for the home infusion division of a very large home health and hospice company and SNF company. So they were nursing homes, home health, and hospice. And they acquired me somewhat by accident. My little pharmacy in Minnesota got acquired like 6 months after I moved there. And for the longest time, they just had no idea what I was or what we were, or who we served. But the nurses in the home care loved us. They were like, the home infusion is such a differentiator, makes us different from a home health perspective to be able to offer that and have our own pharmacy. They were really able to kind of sell it for me as like, oh, this is something we should have and we should keep. And so it can kind of work both ways. You can have the resources of that big system behind you. So when you need to build a new clean room or you need a new computer system or whatever software programs you need, you kind of have access and tap those resources. But oftentimes too, it can be suffocating to have to comply with rules that don't work for you. Like the mandate would come down, all intake is being centralized, right? Well, it's like, okay, time out. Do you
Yeah.
have any idea what intake looks like for home infusion? And then when the bad debt rolls up, they're like, oh, we should have listened to you and let you do your own intake. So, I think it's sometimes there's pros and cons, right, to every model. And our goal is to make it possible for everybody to serve their patients as best they can and get a fair reimbursement rate for it and, communicate the challenges that we're having, starting at the patient and working out versus looking at a company and saying, what is your company interested? Well, I don't really, I'm never going to be able to represent all the different things you care about as a company because everybody's got different interests. But I know that if we focus on things that will help patients, that's going to help everybody. So that's the way.
I think that's a great segue. And when you say that'll help patients, Pam, I want to come to you next. We call Pam kind of our North Star here because we gripe about money, we gripe about tech, we gripe about payers, and Pam goes, guys, patients, people, lives. So Pam, I know you've got another clinician on, you've got another person who, so I want to give you a chance to jump in here early. Before I do want to remind everybody that Beyond the Drip is brought to you by ProChant. ProChant is the country's largest reimbursement company for infusion pharmacy. They're going to be at NHIA and booth 411, and we're so thankful for their investment in Beyond the Drip. And again, wish Paula Roth was here with us, but she'll be at NHIA. Super excited. Pam, what do you want to talk about when it comes to thinking about actual patients?
Well, first of all, the professional way of saying I told you so is this was identified early as an outcome when you're talking about intake. It's really hard when you're trying to teach someone how you work if they don't know really what you do. When you're talking about intake, it is the crux of every home infusion company I've ever worked with. And it seems like the more cumbersome it gets, the harder it is. I don't think there's any substitute for that human knowledge. And it's very, very hard to replicate. So I get it. I get what you're struggled with. One thing that I wanted to talk about is we're finding, and this is across the country, and it's no secret, these acute care models are going to more specialty pharmacy, and the patients that were being serviced by their previous provider, all of a sudden, they don't provide that service line. How do we combat that? What do we do to help these people find access? Because it's not only a problem with the access of the actual service, but the allotment and the product and even how it relates to shortages.
So I think the question that I have around it is, okay, this is the outcome, this is what's happening, but why is it happening? What is the actual problem around why all of a sudden people don't want to invest anymore in parenteral nutrition or in IV antibiotics, which used to be kind of the bread and butter, right? And if you think about it, it takes more investment, right? You have to maintain a clean room facility where specialty can kind of get by without doing much, if any, compounding almost. So you maybe don't need the same type of facility that you had to invest in before. Parenteral nutrition takes a lot of clinical expertise and investment in staff who understand how to care for those patients. The compounding is more complicated. There's more shortages to deal with that product line. And when you look at, what's the return on that investment? What are payers willing to pay? I think to some degree, there was a time where we didn't have as many of those issues, and people were competing for those patients because they were pretty well paying patients for a while, that then people negotiated rates that went down to pretty competitive rates, making it harder to make a profit. And then all of a sudden, we're in a situation post COVID where staff are more expensive, product is more expensive, and now the numbers don't pencil out anymore. And payers, is really hard to get them to go the other direction and to say, oh, wait, that rate we agreed to 2 years ago isn't working for us anymore. And sometimes I would say, while it's certainly traumatic is not too strong a word for the patient community to have to give up their pharmacist and the dietitian and the people they've been working with for maybe a decade or more, potentially, and have to go find someone new and develop those relationships all over again. And you meet these families and they are incredibly stressed and vulnerable, feeling very vulnerable because there's no one, companies out there don't want this business anymore. I think we have to ask ourselves, how do we turn that around, and how do we explain to payers what the reasoning is behind this? And if you find yourself in a situation where your facility is needing a lot of capital investment to upgrade to be compliant with USP standards, and you're barely making it on a bag of PN as it is, where's that money coming from? And so, I think when you talked earlier about we have to describe this as a service, that's absolutely right. They cannot think of us as like a typical pharmacy where we have a commodity, we slap a label on the bag and we send it out. And that dispensing fee or that per diem is, paying for that production. We have to talk about our services and document our services a lot more robustly than what we've ever had to do. Right now, and this is my biggest challenge always, and I spend hours and hours and hours of time trying to figure out a new way to explain to CMS what a pharmacist does in home infusion. What is the service that needs to be paid for that's not currently paid for at ASP +6 for a generic drug and DME? Believe me when I tell you that they still are adamant that margin on ASP +6 is enough to cover whatever a pharmacist is doing for a home infusion patient. They have no understanding. But part of that is, where are we documenting that work? What is that work? How do we define it? How do we measure it? How do we report on it? What value does it have? We have to answer those questions somehow in a much better, more objective way to kind of help payers understand what the return on investment is for them to pay for those services. Now, what gets their attention is patients calling them up, screaming at them, saying, I don't have a provider and I'm headed to the hospital. What am I supposed to do? And payers, I think, are coming to the table in accepting our invitations, largely because they are realizing their networks are not adequate today for that. Now, that creates opportunity for someone, right? And there's a reason why home infusion has never become like Express Scripts, right? Or any of these national mail order pharmacies, because it's not a pharmacy service. It's much more, I always say it's much more like home health, and it's local and it's high touch. And now specialty, less so. You can do more specialty from a centralized pharmacy location and ship things because it's a little less involved on the compounding side and things like that. So I think what you're just seeing is that specialty didn't exist when home infusion first was invented, right? So our model is kind of a blended model today, where I think there always will be a place for people who want to do the traditional home infusion business, because there's plenty of patients out there. It's not that the patients don't exist. It's who wants to make the investment and how do we help them do that so that patients have more options.
Well, and the shortage is just compounded, because think about the metrics around what goes into reformulating a TPN every week because you can't get sodium acetate. I could go on, but I'm not going to do that to you. So when you're talking about reimbursement, the one thing that sticks in my craw, and it is the bane of every home infusion company, is the reimbursement around nursing, which hasn't changed in decades.
What reimbursement around nursing? There's a reimbursement?
To the point where sometimes it's not even worth billing. I hate to say it.
Right.
If you're going to get about a third of what it costs you to put a nurse in that home, how do you even combat that? How can we? The Commission on Nursing Reimbursement and Hospitals is one thing, where they're going to look at that as a cost center and maybe trying to quantify the tasks. But when we already have a service in the home that's reimbursable, but the rates don't even nearly keep up to what inflation is for nursing, it puts us really at a disadvantage. And you can't do a lot of these things without nursing. Do you have any insight to that? Have you gotten anywhere with Capitol Hill?
I actually think it's a commercial payer issue more than something we can work on legislatively. But I think, well, here's what we're doing right now. We actually have a study underway that is looking at how are home infusion nurses spending their time? What do they actually do? Because I think it's kind of on the same, kind of the same argument as the pharmacy argument. I think people have and payers have a perception of what the nurse is doing to serve a home infusion patient. And their vision of that is they go to the home and they infuse a drug. We all know that is sometimes what they do, but that's not most of what they do. So where is the time that they're spending and how much time are they spending and what is that doing? What are they doing for the patients that we're not seeing and articulating? So we have a study going on right now where we're actually doing a time study across multiple companies to say, we want you to track your nursing time for a lot of different types of patients, from an IG patient to an antibiotic patient. And we're going to publish a study, just like we did on the pharmacy time study, and say, this is how much time it takes to take care of a home infusion patient. Now, NHIA can't go to the payer for our members and say, you need to pay us more, but we can share that data with our payer colleagues that we say, here's a study that we've done. Our members can take those studies to their payers and say, did you know that on average, it takes a pharmacist spends on average 35 minutes a day per patient. Now, that's the average. We know the work doesn't always happen that way. You might spend 3 hours on one day and 10 minutes the next day. But if you average that time over the space of a week, it averages out to 35 minutes a day. So start to put numbers to that and say, how much does it cost me to have a pharmacist on staff? And how much is that costing me just for their time to take care of that patient? And so I think if we can have more insight into how much work goes into the visit, ahead of the visit, documenting things after the visit, contacting physicians, working with the pharmacy. I think we definitely underestimate how much time we spend just on care coordination. I mean, you have so many entities involved in these patients and they're getting more complicated, a lot of them. And so making sure everybody's just on the same page can take multiple phone calls and a lot of time. And so I think if we can kind of be able to say, this is the fully loaded time for a nursing visit front to back, and explain that, hopefully maybe that also can just at least inform the discussion a little more when you are having those conversations about rates.
Yeah.
It's a great segue because all of that's about data, right? I mean, we've got to collect data and data tells a story. And, we talk all the time, Brandon, that's your softball pitch that I'm throwing here. That's your world you live in the world of data and tech, and, let you get in here and jump in with something.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, John. And Connie, John mentioned, us at Rock Pond and the data initiative. My first question is actually about that, right? And, it's been going on for quite a few years now. So what great nuggets of gold have you guys been able to garner from that initiative? And how's that helped tell our story?
So, the first data initiative and the first study we did was, I think, back in 2007, 2008. And we published that book, and it took an enormous amount of effort. But what I think we learned from that effort more than anything else is that we need to standardize some terminology, and we need to all define things the same way, so that if we want to collect data that is comparable, we have to be working off the same definition. So one of the things that we've invested a lot in is standardized definitions for clinical outcomes, for things like we just published a new definition for adherence. How do you measure adherence for a home infusion patient? And we're working on these definitions, and they're not all clinical. One of the things I've tasked, Bill Noyes and his payer advisory committee with is, we need to talk about what is an adequate network for home infusion. When you look at how do you define an adequate network for physicians, it's based on how far is that physician from where I live, how long do I have to wait to get an appointment, and those are the kind of metrics they use to determine if they have enough healthcare in a community, say, so are there enough primary care doctors, for example? They use those, or they use ratios, doctors to population. What is that for home infusion? How do we give a payer some metrics and say, this is what you need to have an adequate home infusion network? And so we're working on things like that can be useful so everybody's, again, speaking the same language and trying to get payers on the same page with, if you're going to capture outcomes, then this is the definition or this is the outcome you should be measuring, because everybody's going to use the same terminology and define things the same way. And so I think that helps further that conversation. And it's a lot of laying a lot of groundwork toward hopefully someday getting payers to kind of put their money where their mouth is and do some value-based care around home infusion. Because I think we win on that every time. But we also have to be open to some new ways of doing things if we want to go down that road.
Right. No, that's interesting. And again, going on data, now that we're here, we're a year out of Change Healthcare's big breach, right? And I'm sure we're still years out from seeing the final tip of the tail of the impact to that. What are you hearing from the members and stuff about, data security and their concerns about what keeps them up at night?
I mean, if you talk to the CEOs, that someone's going to click on the wrong link when they get a spam email and the entire company to, a major hack. I mean, that is a real nightmare scenario that happens. And that's how these hackers get in half the time is, just somebody inadvertently and they're getting so much smarter and savvier. And, I consider myself pretty good at sniffing these things out, and they still every once in a while get me to look twice. But I think that's one thing. But I also think people are looking at their systems and saying, what redundancies do we have built in? Do we have a backup to our backup, or do we have any backup at all? To, the way I think you used to be pretty comfortable that as long as your vendor was up and running and the software was working, you were good. Now you can't take for granted anymore that, your plan A is always going to be functional. You need a plan B and a plan C to keep your claims moving. We learned a lot from that experience, honestly, about just having multiple switches and not having just all your claims running through one channel. And I do think most people have kind of built in redundancies now because of that.
Right. Yeah. And one of the other things that, we're seeing is, a lot of our clients are, in the middle of a system conversion, and they're just their mindset of, basically I host the technology on my side versus it being in, a cloud. They struggle with that. They're like, we're used to having all this control. I said, yeah, but you're an army of one where your software vendor can deploy a lot more resources than you could ever think of because you're shared. And so, but again, right, we think, well, gosh, change was so big, and it was far bigger than our industry, right? I mean, hospitals were impacted and all this kind of stuff. So it's really interesting to see that. But, interesting to hear your initial thoughts on a quote that I heard somebody say last year after this is PHI now is more valuable on the dark web than date of birth and social security number ever was.
That's probably true. Yeah. I mean, if it's got a ransom value to it, probably is. Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing that it feels like that's the story now, right? Like for years we were told, just don't have your social security number. Now we're like, well, we don't care about social security number. Like we really care about a set of PHI, and so it's an incredible place to be at. And so, kind of finishing up talking about revenue cycle, good talk about revenue cycle because we have to stay in business, all of our folks get paid every 2 weeks to do their great job and everything. And so again, really thinking about what Paula Roth, who is not from ProChant, who's not here, but she wanted to talk about, and she personally was upset about not being able to be here, but she wanted to ask you about the payer summit and, the payer summit and future plans and kind of the purpose and outcomes behind the NHIA payer summit.
So, I mean, I think we kind of talked about it a little bit earlier that the approach is going to be different in terms of having more of a payer council.
Okay.
And, one of the things that we have been trying to work on is updating our HCPCS codes. And, we've put forward some good suggestions about updating. Like right now, we have one code for a specialty drug for infliximab. We have no code for all these specialty drugs out there, right? So how do you contract a rate for something like Blincyto versus something that is a simple injectable that you slap, you don't compound it. You just have to put the label on it. And you can certainly there's always patient care assessments and coordination and things like that. But, the complexity, the facility you need, the process of preparation, the planning around initiating care is not the same for every specialty drug out there. And we don't have a way to code those things differently. And so we need to make some updates, right? So this coding system has served us well. It's been around for whatever 30 years now, but it's literally not changed. Think of any other industry that hasn't updated how they bill for services. And, to some degree, if it's not working, and I would say this about parenteral nutrition and even enterals, is the per diem really working for us today? Is that model working? Because, like, for example, you take on a really complex patient. What if they go back in 3 days? All that work you put into getting that patient home is out the window if they go back to the hospital 3 days later. But
Yeah.
what if we were thinking more episodically and you could say, look, I'm going to get a 30-day episode payment for this patient. I now know I'm getting X amount of dollars. Maybe I can invest in more nursing visits up front. Maybe I can invest in different catheter approach for this patient if they're high risk for infection, or do whatever is needed to be done to make sure that patient doesn't go back. Because maybe if you keep them out of the hospital for 30 days, you get a bonus at the end of that. That's value-based care. We have to think differently, and we have to let ourselves come out of this framework of I get X amount per day, many days in a row, and that's how I'm eventually going to recoup my front-end investment. And so I think it's going to just take those kinds of conversations with payers to see who's open to having these discussions and looking at putting pilots together and collecting the data we can then use to support the value of a program like that, and that the outcomes are moving in the right direction. So that's where I hope to see those conversations go around. Conversations with payers is seeing if we can find some areas where we both agree the current approach is not working for anyone.
It's funny you say that. I think about specialty, and I think about, they're able to tell that story. They're able to say, well, oh, those drugs are too expensive. Well, what's 4 weeks in the hospital for, a readmission worth? That's why this Hep C drug cost, and they were able to tell that story. So there's no reason that we shouldn't be able to tell that story. I want to kind of, as we land this plane, I want to tell you a story, and maybe just off the cuff, let you just talk about the world you kind of dream of. And so I was talking to a pharmacy, been around a long time. And the reality is, as much as we are a business, a lot of our pharmacies are ran by pharmacists. Okay. And they didn't go to school to think about their profits and their margin and what their DSO is. And they didn't do that, right? They went to take care of people, and they've fallen into this love, right? But they want to do that. They got a TPN patient. I think the patient was 4 or 5 years old, and they just recently posted a picture of their clinician, their nurse, at that patient's high school graduation. And I want to think and ask you, as you lead this org, and how do you continue to build a world where that can happen, where for 11, 12 straight years, a company sees a child through this terrible affliction to their high school? I just think it's a beautiful picture. How do we stay there and not become, oh gosh, we got to big box this, right? There was a day where, you could do that. How do we build that world?
I think we are building that world. I mean, I think we do it every single day. And whether the patient is on their entire life through graduation, or you literally are helping a family keep a loved one at home versus having to send them to a nursing home, and you get them over that critical period of needing the IV antibiotics for 7 or 8 or whatever, 10 days, you're doing that on a small scale every single day. And you know what I know? The reason I know people start that they get it is, and this is absolutely true, is I work, I go to DC all the time, and I'm always telling the story, right, of the impact home infusion has. And the number one thing patients will say to me if I meet patients is they always say, home infusion gave me my life back. That is the difference home infusion makes. When you go to like a different setting of care and you get the service, and then you go home, you realize that now my life revolves around the things I want it to revolve around, not when I need my infusion. And so I think that's why people stay in this industry. That's why they're here. And that's why they go by what I did when I first took my management job and realized, okay, now I have to figure out accounting, getting accounting for dummies, because I had no idea what an accrual was. So learning my way through the financials and things like that, we do it because we also see the impact that we're having on patients' lives every single day. That never gets old, and they keep you going. And so I think that's what the secret ingredient is to this whole industry and our conference and the community we have, is we've all seen that and we know what impact we're having. And that's why we keep plugging away at the problems and the challenges that we face.
Yeah, I think you're right. And finishing here, the conference is an opportunity for, I say it's kind of like a battlefield hospital. A whole bunch of people get together and be like, I never get to talk to anybody who's going through this every day. And they're like, yeah. And they mostly do that in the lobby bar. But still, I love your staff. I love NHIA. It's just literally our Super Bowl in the industry. We're excited. We're 31 days away. So, when you think about your staff, I want a couple questions here as we finish up. Average day, how much sleep do you get? When's your first coffee? Is there a day that you say, this is the peak day? Like, this is where it just peaks. And I kind of I'm seeing double. Like, tell us a little bit about what it takes to put this thing on as we go into it.
Oh, yeah. I say it's like putting on a wedding for 10,000 guests every year. I'd love to have 10,000 people. Okay. So let's say 2,000 people every year. And so it's just very similar. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff to do early on, like pick the location and the date. And, you kind of do all those bigger decisions. And then it's kind of slow for a little while over the summer. We can all kind of catch our breath. And then January 1 hits and that's really way before that. It's usually more like September, October, but it all ramps up, speakers and details. And then as it gets closer, it's like speeches and writing scripts and thinking of fun things to do. And lots and lots of details. So it's very much like that kind of a cycle of planning a wedding. Anybody who knows me I am like a major coffee snob. And so I finally kind of put my foot down and said, we have to have an espresso machine at the NHIA booth now every day. They used to bring it in like once a day. So I literally have an espresso machine in my room because I need to be able to go get coffee frequently. And so I drink a lot of cappuccino. That's how
I bet. Well, listen, again, you've just got this wonderful staff. They're all great. Marianne's my favorite. She paid me to say that, but she is. Hey, listen, Connie, thanks so much. Everybody, this has been Beyond the Drip with President and CEO of NHIA, Connie Sullivan. Super excited, Connie, that you would give us the time, and particularly 31 days out from this event. So I would just say, before we kind of sign off here, that if you've never been, you should go. If you've been, then you should go back. I just don't know of anything in the industry that, as far as 3 days, that you can get the most out of. And so to all of our co-hosts, thank you. And particularly Connie, thanks so much for being here with us. It was an absolute joy to have.
Thank you guys so much. I look forward to seeing all of you in about a month.
Absolutely. We'll see you then.
Thanks, Connie.
At ProChant, we're obsessed with revenue capture. Revenue cycle management isn't just a back office process. It's the engine that keeps your business moving. That's why we partner with you to keep things running smoothly and securely, from intake to collections, so you can prioritize cash, not the chaos. We specialize in home-based care, combining US-led teams, AI-powered workflows, and transparent dashboards to drive guaranteed results. We leverage over 25 years of experience to optimize your RCM with proven best practices tailored to fit your specific needs. Our expert RCM pros are backed by powerful tech, giving you better efficiency, better revenue capture, and more time to focus on what really matters, your patients. Because when your financial engine's firing on all cylinders, everything else moves forward. ProChant. Contact us now to talk to an expert.